Imagine a room filled with dozens of witnesses, a clear Sunday afternoon, and a crime so brazen it should have been resolved within minutes, yet not a single soul would speak. In the heart of Salford, a carefully orchestrated strike didn't just fail. It inverted, leaving the aggressors as the deceased and the target walking away. The date was March 12, 2006. Inside the Brass Handles pub, the atmosphere was typical for a weekend. Manchester United was facing off against Newcastle, and the local crowd was focused entirely on the screen. The air was thick with the cheers of fans, completely unaware that a dark narrative was about to unfold in their peripheral vision. This wasn't a sudden burst of spontaneous anger. It was a cold, calculated attempt at a final resolution for a long-standing underworld grievance. Two young men, faces concealed and hearts likely racing, stepped through those doors with a singular, fatal intent. They were there for a man named David Totten, a figure whose reputation in the area was as formidable as it was polarizing. The transition from a relaxed social gathering to a scene of absolute chaos happened in the blink of an eye. As the two newcomers located their target near the snooker room, the familiar sounds of the football match were punctuated by the sharp, terrifying cracks of a firearm. The victim was struck multiple times at close-range injuries that, by any logical metric, should have been the end of the story. But in this baffling mystery, the expected outcome was discarded. Instead of the attackers making a swift exit, the environment inside the pub shifted from fear to a fierce, collective resistance. The crowd did not scatter. They surged. In a sequence of events that remained shrouded in the local code of silence, the two young men were quickly overwhelmed and disarmed. They managed to stumble out of the building and onto the nearby greenery, but the damage was already done. They collapsed on the grass, their lives lost to the very tools they had brought to the scene. What followed was perhaps even more surreal than the event itself. As the emergency services arrived to find a crime scene of immense proportions, they encountered a community that had instantly retreated into a fortress of silence. The CCTV system had been physically removed. Evidence was nowhere to be found. The target of the hit, despite his severe injuries, refused to offer a single word of assistance to the authorities. It was a stark reminder of the Salford wire world, where the law is an outsider and problems are managed internally. The investigators were left with a massive puzzle. Two young men from a different part of the city were gone. A known local figure was recovering in secret, and an entire pub full of people claimed to have seen absolutely nothing. This was not just a failed hit, it was a window into a hidden war, where the lines between the hunter and the hunted are often blurred by the desperation of those caught in the middle. When the dust settled and the sirens began to wail, the true tragedy of the event started to materialize in the names of the deceased: Richard Austin, aged 19, and Carlton Alvarenga, just 20. These were not the hardened, weathered faces of career assassins often depicted in underworld folklore. Instead, they were young men from Moss Side, an area of Manchester that has historically grappled with the heavy weight of social challenges and territorial tensions. To those who knew them, they weren't masterminds or cold-blooded enforcers. They were individuals who had found themselves entangled in a web of debt and obligation, caught in a system where their lives were viewed as currency rather than human beings. The investigation would eventually suggest that these two were never meant to be the leaders of a criminal enterprise. They were the pawns, pushed to the front lines of a conflict they likely didn't fully understand. The psychology behind selecting such inexperienced individuals for a high-risk operation is as chilling as it is strategic. In the eyes of the architects who remained in the shadows, Austin and Alvarenga were expendable assets. If the hit succeeded, the primary target would be removed, and the masterminds would remain insulated by several layers of separation. If it failed, as it so spectacularly did, the loss was considered acceptable in the brutal arithmetic of the streets. This disposable nature is a hallmark of certain criminal structures, where the youth and desperation of the vulnerable are exploited to shield those at the top. On that Sunday afternoon, the two young men weren't driven by a desire for power, but by the crushing weight of a slate that needed to be wiped clean. They were reportedly nudged and, perhaps even physically pressured by those who stood to benefit from the target's removal. As they sat in the parked vehicle outside the Brass Handles, the atmosphere inside must have been one of suffocating dread. Evidence later indicated that they were hesitant, lacking the cold confidence of seasoned players. They were young men walking into a lion's den, aware that the man they were targeting was far more than a simple mark. David Totten was deeply connected and notoriously volatile, and the pub they were entering was familiar territory for his associates. To enter such a space required more than just a weapon. It required a level of hardened indifference that neither Austin nor Alvarenga truly possessed. Their failure wasn't just a matter of a jammed weapon or a quick-thinking crowd. It was the inevitable result of a plan that relied on the desperation of the inexperienced. They were sent into the eye of a storm with the expectation that they would either sink or swim, and tragically, the tide turned against them before they could even find their footing. This segment of the story serves as a somber reflection on how the most vulnerable members of a community are often the first to pay the ultimate price for the ambitions of others. While the trigger was pulled by young hands, the intent was forged by older, more calculating minds, who viewed these two lives as a small price to pay for a temporary advantage in a hidden war. While the two young men were left to face the immediate and devastating consequences of the afternoon, the individuals who set the gears in motion were miles away, cocooned in what they believed was an impenetrable layer of plausible deniability. To understand why this unfortunate event took place, one must look toward the shadows. Where Bobby Spears and Ian McLeod operated, Spears, a figure with deep ties to the regional criminal landscape, was the alleged visionary behind the plot. However, he was far too experienced to be anywhere near the scene of the crime. On the day of the attempt, Spears had secured himself a seat in an executive box at Old Trafford. As he watched Manchester United take on Newcastle, he wasn't just enjoying a game. He was constructing a digital and physical alibi. By surrounding himself with high-profile witnesses and public visibility, he believed he had successfully detached himself from the chaos unfolding in Salford. The bridge between the mastermind's intent and the execution of the act was Ian McLeod. As a veteran associated with the South Manchester Doddington network, McLeod was the logistical engine of the operation. He was responsible for the acquisition of the tools, the selection of the manpower, and the direct oversight of the hit. While Spears maintained his distance, McLeod was the one reportedly applying the pressure to Austin and Alvarenga, ensuring they didn't back out of a task for which they were clearly ill-equipped. To complete the circle, the conspirators placed a spotter inside the Brass Handles pub, Constance Howorth. To the casual observer, she was just another patron enjoying a drink. But in reality, she was the eyes and ears of the operation. Her role was clinical and cold. She monitored the target's movements and relayed real-time updates to McLeod via mobile phone, ensuring the shooters knew exactly where to strike. The catalyst for this elaborate and dangerous scheme was remarkably petty, a perceived slight that escalated into a fatal conspiracy. Rumors suggested the friction began weeks earlier at a nightclub, where David Totten was denied entry. When he looked to Bobby Spears to vouch for him, Spears reportedly ignored the request, leading to a public loss of face for Totten. In a world where reputation is the only currency that matters, such a snub was not taken lightly. Totten's subsequent presence at the Brass Handler Spears' own local haunt was seen as a direct challenge, a territorial intrusion that Spears felt he could not ignore without looking weak. It was a classic example of how a minor dispute in the underworld can spiral into a heavy-handed and life-altering tragedy. This section of the narrative reveals a disturbing level of coordination. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence, but a tiered operation involving a mastermind, a facilitator, a spotter, and the disposable foot soldiers. The conspirators relied on a mix of high-tech communication and old-school intimidation, believing that their careful planning would shield them from the law. They underestimated, however, the unpredictability of human reaction and the growing sophistication of digital forensics. As Spears sat in his VIP seat, confident in his alibi, he had no idea that the very technology he used to coordinate the strike would eventually become the primary evidence used to dismantle his freedom. In the immediate aftermath of the intense and baffling incident at the Brass Handles, the Greater Manchester Police were met with a wall of silence, so thick, it felt like a physical barrier. While dozens of patrons had been present for the tragedy, when the time came for statements, the collective memory of the community seemed to have vanished into thin air. No one claimed to have seen the faces of the deceased. No one could identify who had returned fire, and the physical evidence was remarkably scarce for such a high-profile public event. The CCTV system, which should have provided a frame-by-frame account of the confrontation, had been violently extracted from the wall and removed. It was a clear, defiant message to the authorities. In this pocket of Salford, justice was not something sought through official channels. Even the primary targets, recovering from their severe wounds in the hospital, maintained a steadfast refusal to cooperate. It appeared that the investigation might stall before it even truly began, held back by a deeply ingrained code of loyalty and fear that effectively transcended the standard rule of law. However, where human witnesses failed, digital footprints began to speak with undeniable clarity. Near the area where the two young men had lost their lives, investigators recovered two discarded mobile phones. These small, seemingly insignificant devices became the essential keys to unlocking a massive, invisible network of coordination. One of the handsets was a basic pay-as-you-go model, the kind often used to maintain anonymity, but a single, mundane transaction provided the vital breakthrough the detectives desperately needed. The phone had been topped up at a local supermarket, and in a moment of oversight, the purchase was linked to a common supermarket loyalty card registered to Ian McLeod. This was the first thread in a complex web that would eventually pull the entire criminal enterprise into the light. By meticulously cross-referencing call data and cell tower locations, the police began to map out a frantic flurry of communication that occurred in the hours and minutes surrounding the shooting. The data revealed a chilling level of synchronicity. While Bobby Spears was visible to thousands at the Manchester United match, his phone was incredibly active, maintaining constant contact with McLeod. Simultaneously, Constance Howorth was transmitting covert messages from her seat at the bar, directly to the coordination team outside. The investigation shifted from a search for elusive eyewitnesses to a complex, forensic analysis of electronic signals and precise timestamps. The detectives realized that the perfect alibi Spears had constructed at Old Trafford was actually his greatest point of vulnerability. The calls placed from the executive box aligned perfectly with the movements of the shooters and the updates from the spotter inside the pub. It was a digital map of a conspiracy, proving that this tragedy wasn't a spontaneous local brawl, but a cold, coordinated strike orchestrated from a position of perceived safety. The silence of the pub patrons no longer mattered as much because the airwaves had already told the story. The investigators were now moving from a baffling mystery to a documented legal case, proving that even in a world where no one speaks, everyone leaves a digital trace. The legal reckoning for this intricate conspiracy began in March 2007 at Preston Crown Court. But for the prosecution, the challenge was immense. They had to prove a fatal intent without the benefit of a single cooperating witness from the scene. Yet, the mountain of digital evidence provided a narrative that no amount of silence could erase. Ian McLeod and Constance Howorth stood before the court, facing charges related to the conspiracy that had turned a quiet Sunday into a local tragedy. The prosecution meticulously dismantled Howorth's defense of her claim that she was just a girl with no knowledge of the Underworld's inner workings. The jury saw her differently, a calculated operative who had used her position at the bar to direct the young shooters toward their targets, with cold precision text messages. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. McLeod, the veteran coordinator, was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 21 years. Howorth, whose role as the spotter earned her a formidable reputation in the press, received a life sentence with a minimum of 20 years. Despite her later attempts to appeal, the judicial system remained firm, noting that her involvement was central to the operation's execution. However, the man who had allegedly set the entire tragedy in motion, Bobby Spears, remained a ghost. He had fled to Spain, seeking refuge among the expat communities of Benidorm, believing that the distance would shield him from the consequences of his actions. His freedom was short-lived. In 2008, the reach of the law extended across the continent, as a European arrest warrant finally brought him back to the United Kingdom to face the reality of his choices. In 2009, Spears finally stood trial. The court described the plot as a ruthless and calculated attempt at a public execution, one that showed a staggering disregard for the safety of the families and bystanders present that day. Like his associates before him, Spears was found guilty of conspiracy to commit a fatal act and was handed a life sentence with a minimum of 23 years. The legal saga concluded with the masterminds behind bars, yet the story remains a haunting case study in the dynamics of criminal exploitation. While the planners faced justice, the silence surrounding the actual physical confrontation that took the lives of Richard Austin and Carlton Alvarenga remains unbroken to this day. No one was ever charged with the specific acts that led to their passing on the grass outside the pub, a lingering testament to the power of the local code. Ultimately, this baffling mystery serves as a sobering reminder of the true cost of these hidden wars. Austin and Alvarenga were labeled by the court as expendable. Two young men who lost their futures in service of a grievance that wasn't even theirs. Their lives were the collateral damage in a game of reputation and perceived respect played by those too cowardly to step onto the front lines themselves. If this deep dive into one of the region's most complex underworld moments has intrigued you, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. We are committed to bringing you the most detailed, policy-compliant accounts of the cases that shaped the legal and criminal history of the UK. Thank you for watching, and stay vigilant.